I got a job in San Diego not too long after the pandemic settled. It was an exciting time, but I was also anxious about finding a place to live. I didn't have that much saved up, so I had to find somewhere a bit more lenient to newcomers. I signed up to all kinds of lists and tenant groups, but most leads were dead in the water. The only place within my price range had a no pets policy, and I couldn't bring myself to rehome my cat Marmalade. Poor thing was just a year old, and a complete mama's girl. After weeks of searching, I stumbled upon a landlord with a vacant spot. He hadn't even got time to list it. All I'd seen was a post about a cheap apartment. I messaged him spontaneously and asked about it. Turns out, the previous tenant had passed away. It was on the 4th floor, not too far off Main Street, and surprisingly cheap. Cat-friendly too. He offered me a deal. If I paid for the cleanup crew, the place was mine. I couldn't say no. Once the place was cleaned up, I met up with my new landlord and got the keys handed to me. My new place was on the top floor of this beautiful old building made somewhere back in the 50s. Cool stone-tiled floors, spacious ceilings, and plenty of sunlight coming in from the body-sized windows. There was a sort of French balcony with a little place to smoke or have a mini garden. There was a large living room area, a tiny kitchenette, and a cramped little bedroom on the sunny side. It wasn't much, but I could see myself growing attached to it. You could tell it was old though. There were all kinds of little quirks. A lock that you had to jiggle, pipes that rumbled a little whenever you took a shower, and you could immediately tell if one of your neighbors were smoking because of the shitty ventilation. It was far from perfect, but for that price, at that location, I couldn't ask for a better deal. The one thing that dated it more than anything else, however, was the strange 70s wallpaper. This intricate floral pattern covered most of the living room, along with the western wall of the bedroom. A dark gray base color with lines of white, roses, tulips, sunflowers, all in variations of silver and blue. It was beautiful, in a sort of primitive Art Deco kind of way, but you could tell it was old. I promised myself I'd get it replaced if I were to live there long term. It didn't take too long to move in. I didn't have much in the way of furniture, and I didn't really have the money to bring in something new. I figured I'd settle for what little I had for the time being, instead focusing on getting used to my new job. I was working as a full-time consultant for a telecom company, mostly focusing on process management and evaluation. Might not sound that interesting, but you get a lot of wiggle room to really switch things up for the better. Post-pandemic, we were on routine for a single weekly meeting and the rest could be done from our home office. It felt kind of dumb to force people to come in once a week just because. But if I wanted the job, that was the deal. Marmalade got settled in that place long before I did. She found a sunny spot next to one of the big windows. I set up a cozy basket for her to snuggle into. I, on the other hand, was having trouble sleeping for the first few nights. I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. I'd lost myself in that view, sort of like when you're looking down into dark waters. You can't really see where it ends. It's just this perpetual nothingness, and you can imagine it continuing forever. That first week went by in a flash. I had my first meeting and got my first assignment, process assessment at one of the branch offices in Pittsburgh. Long distance, with an in-person evaluation at the end of the 2-month cycle. Nothing I couldn't handle, but said office had a sort of reputation for being unmanageable. It was the kind of assignment you throw at someone to see if they got the chops for it long term. That first day was mostly meet and greets, with a tiny after-work event at one of the downtown bars. It was mostly an excuse to crack a few cold ones on a Monday. My new colleagues were a few decibels louder than I was used to, so I ended up sitting mostly in the background, learning to appreciate a small label dark pumpkin ale. The next day, I was in full work mode. I set up my laptop with a view of my awful wallpaper to make it look a bit more office-like. Marmalade wasn't moving from her new favorite spot by the window, so there were no fluffy tails in the way of my webcam. I had a long talk with the branch manager, along with a few technicians, to just sort of dip my toe in the water. They were all courteous though, but I could tell that they'd been through the ringer a couple of times. This wasn't their first assignment, and it wouldn't be their last. By the end of the day, I was talking with one of the salesmen, a woman named Deirdre. At that point, I'd been in constant Zoom calls for over 4 hours, and my voice was giving out. Deirdre could tell I was exhausted, and we ended up just talking about other things instead. My apartment, my job, my cat. I had to bother Marmalade a bit to show her off. Deirdre showed off her own feline companion, a 3-year-old ragdoll named Popeye. Ironically, that call ended up being my longest, but it went by the fastest. Deirdre was a gem. I spent most of my time settling up questionnaires and mapping out the overall structure. I was in daily calls, bouncing emails all the way down the supply chain, trying to get a clear picture of the main issues. It was the same old story that I'd heard 100 times before. Management blaming the salesman blaming the warehouse, and the warehouse blaming the technicians. There were little hitches all the way down the road, ranging from dated inventory systems to useless red tape. After the first few days, I started getting into a routine, ping-ponging between meetings and Excel spreadsheets. Marmalade and I made the apartment into a proper home. Chinese takeout boxes started lining the kitchenette, and I had a few extra talks with Deirdre just to pass the slow hours. I started getting used to that place, even the awful wallpaper. I stopped hearing the rumbling pipes after a while, and the cigarette smoke from the neighbors slowly blended into the background smells. I stopped waking from the cars passing on the streets below, and my first paycheck went into making the living room look like something that could actually be lived in. I remember one night when I was working overtime, I got a late email about submitting a progress report, so I had to stay up making a presentation. I found myself by the opinion that this was looking more and more like a management issue. Who the hell sends that kind of email at 4:50 p.m. on a Thursday, expecting it to be done before lunch the next day? Unbelievable. I was done by about 10 p.m. when I shambled away from my laptop. I picked up a can of cat food for Marmalade and walked over to her favorite window. Only she wasn't there. Her bed was still there, but Marmalade had moved to another window, still sleeping soundly, but she'd found a new favorite spot. It felt strange in a way, like the entire apartment had shifted a little. Looking up at the wallpaper, I could have sworn the patterns had moved. It looked identical, just a bit off. I could have sworn it was different, despite looking exactly the same. It was a strange feeling. Everything felt familiar, but that one little twist made it feel like a new room. I was starting to doubt myself. When looking at Marmalade out of her basket, however, it was clear that something was different, in some way. The next few days, I started to notice this shift in new ways. The walls would look different at night, where at one point I'd see a sunflower, I'd see a rose the next day. Then again, I wasn't ever really sure, and I chalked it up to me just not paying attention. Marmalade would move from spot to spot, never really sure what her favorite ever was. One night, she couldn't settle in at all, instead moving from one window to the next, meowing at me anxiously. That night as I lay awake, I had my eyes firmly fixed on the wall. I could imagine the patterns moving on their own, the many flowers gently swaying to an invisible wind. It was just that kind of unreal surrealist thought you catch just before you fall asleep. But in that moment, I could have sworn it was real, living even. As I closed my eyes, I could imagine the dark gray background color to be as deep as an ocean, a darkness stretching into a distant nothing. The next day, as I was making my morning coffee, I noticed something peculiar. I stepped on a dry blue petal. I couldn't explain where it came from. I had no flowers in my apartment, and the ventilation was so shit that it could barely rotate air. Flower petals were out of the question. Marmalade played with it for a while, and I convinced myself that it was just something I dragged in. Still, it reminded me of a flower petal from the blue roses on the wallpaper. It made me anxious, but I couldn't figure out why. What was I even worried about? I couldn't let that thought go for the rest of the day, that I was missing something obvious, or maybe that there really was something to my strange paranoia. So at the end of the day, when I talked to Deirdre, I brought it up. I explained that there was just something inherently creepy about living here, like an uncomfortable thought tickling your neck when you're not looking. Deirdre tried to reassure me, her chuckle coming through my headphones. "It takes time, love," she said. "You just got there. Besides, everything looks strange in the dark." "Yeah, I just can't shake the feeling, you know," I explained. "Like there's something more to it." "Like what?" I didn't know what to answer. As I stepped into the living room, I noticed Marmalade rolling over the living room carpet, casually playing with another blue petal. Turning on the light, I could see more of them. Over a dozen dry blue petals lining the edge of the wall. Finally, I could tell I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't a one-time deal. That was real. Marmalade didn't seem to mind it though. "I'm gonna have to get back to you," I told Deirdre. Something just came up. As the call ended, I started scooping up the petals by hand. The moment my knees hit the floor, there was a power surge. It was all so quick. A flash to black. Marmalade hissed, looking straight past me, and I could hear a rustling noise, like a large animal moving through a bush. As quick as it had come, it went, leaving only a startled cat in my elevated pulse behind. The lights were slapped back on with a click, blinding me. Marmalade retreated behind the couch as I picked up the rest of the petals. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the many patterns, petals in hand. I could imagine the gray sinking deeper and deeper, showing me something past the obvious. Like one of those images you have to look cross-eyed to see the truth. I had the same sensation, like I was missing something obvious. I could imagine hearing things, deep in an imagined forest. I could hear branches snapping. I could imagine the blue flowers swaying in the wind. And somewhere in all that depthness dark, something roamed, something looking for an exit. At some point, I snapped to attention. There was a loud electrical noise, an alarm. It was already morning. For some alien reason, I'd been stuck there for hours, just staring at the hypnotizing patterns. An entire night's rest, gone. It wasn't until I stepped away that I realized just how exhausted I really was. My legs had locked on place, kneeling me over straight to the stone-tiled living room floor. Marmalade rushed over, worried about the sudden development. I spent a few minutes just sitting there, calming myself down. The ringing from my cell phone was going strong, trying to give me enough time to shower before my first morning meeting. And yet, I just sat there, slowly petting my cat, my eyes bobbing in and out of sleep, my body deprived. Where'd I been all night? What had I seen? I barely made it through that day, having a 45-minute nap over lunch. By the time I finished my last interview, I was a shell of my old self, barely conscious. I filled Marmalade's food and water bowl and crawled into bed with all my clothes still on. The moment I closed my eyes, I could hear something in the distance. In the half-world between sleeping and waking, I heard breaking branches, owls taking flight, and something large approaching. And despite I knowing I was well and truly alone, my body screamed at me to wake, to have one more look, just in case. I did. I forced my eyes open. Something sharp scratched against the stone-tiled floor, something retreating in haste. A trail of dry petals leading up to the side of my bed. After a night of dreamless sleep, I woke up to choking on something. It took me almost a full minute to cough up a blue petal, several of which had been sprinkled throughout my bed. I could have sworn the wallpaper looked a bit lighter, as if several flowers were looking sparse. The whole wall looked a bit darker. That morning I'd had enough. I called in sick and brought out my toolbox. I started scraping off the wallpaper, piece by piece, across the entire apartment. I made a day of it, listening to music as Marmalade looked at me curiously. Every illustrated petal and stem dropped to the floor, cut by cut, like trimming a paper garden. By the end of the day, my wall was laid bare, revealing nothing but black lead painted concrete underneath. That night, after a long shower, I went to sleep with wallpaper remains still lining the edge of the room. Finally, I could focus. I could look past the hypnotizing patterns. It was done. Gone. Over. Except it wasn't. As I went to sleep, my eyes drifted to the barren walls. A black, eternal night, now unhindered by what little paper-thin barrier had been erected. Just looking at it gave me that feeling in my stomach, like I was falling forward. Even closing my eyes felt brighter than staring into it, like it was more than a color, a place. At some point in the night, I heard this loud howl. Looking up, I could see Marmalade sitting at the edge of my bed, staring straight at the wall, hissing and raising her heckles. Looking straight ahead, I saw something. There, deep in the dark of the bare wall, something moved. I swooped up Marmalade, who clung to my shoulder like a parrot. I threw on my pants, shirt, and got my bag. I'd had enough. I wasn't about to stick around to find out the depths of what was either my own insanity or something unnatural entirely. I didn't want to know. As I entered the living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Every single wall had turned to midnight black. The windows had fogged up from the inside, blocking the moonlight from peeking in. I ran my hand along the wall, looking for the door. Something cold bumped against the palm of my hand. A finger. I recoiled, almost dropping Marmalade in surprise. I couldn't see my door. As I looked around, trying to find my bearings, I slowly came to the realization that nothing was quite as it should be. The kitchenette was further away. The windows were further apart. The proportions of the room were off, and seemingly shifting every time I blinked. It was as if everything in that darkness was untrue, malleable, subtly shifting as I looked away. And so I was, looking down at my hands. They seemed different with every blink of my eye. They could be older, younger, scarred, masculine. It was impossible to tell. It was just diffuse enough for an anxious mind to fill in the blanks. But it felt like more than that. It wasn't just a fear of the dark. It was the dark changing me. Finally, I fumbled my way to the front door and pulled it open. And there was nothing. Just a solid black nothing. The apartment was getting darker. Even the windows were turning black. The kitchen sink was running, pushing forth dark nondescript globs, all of which had this peculiar chemical smell. Ammonia? Marmalade was freaking out. She clung to me, digging her claws into my shirt, hissing at something in the dark. Whenever I turned around, the room would look different, swallowed further and further by the night. I could see vague silhouettes, hands reaching forward, some small, some impossibly large. I could imagine creatures the size of skyscrapers, towering forward, impish little beasts nipping at my heels. I curled into a ball on the floor, clutching Marmalade close to my chest. Together, we stared down anything and everything creeping closer. But I was losing. My light was dying. It was all going dark. Then I felt a rumble. I'd forgotten my phone was still in my pants. Bringing it forward, I had a new message from Deirdre, the little screen lighting up a little bubble around me. I wasn't even on the floor anymore. I was sitting on a pile of dry grass and blue petals. and I could see the edge of a dead field stretching out around me in all directions. A wind cut through me like cold glass, and there really were things moving out there. Some big, some small, all vague and horrifying, waiting for me to look away long enough to take shape. "Hey, hun, I heard you were feeling under the weather, so I just wanted to check in. Get plenty of rest. We'll talk soon." I played it again and again. I filled my head with her voice, and my eyes with what little light my phone struggled to provide. I could feel Marmalade's pulse beating against my neck. Something would brush against me, a light kick against my foot, footsteps rushing past. I saw nothing, but they were there, hidden in the dark. "We'll talk soon." Deirdre's message repeated for the 10th time. "We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon. We'll talk soon." I don't know how long I sat there, just waiting for the dark to pass, but nothing came of it. The battery was dying. As it reached the final few percentages of power, there was little left for me to do. The light was shrinking. I couldn't hear Deirdre's message anymore. Marmalade was yowling like crazy, hissing and striking at something unseen. As the screen died, I felt the chill of the world descend on me, in the silence, and I could feel something approaching, something careful and calculated. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, smiling at me, leering, eager. I was panicking. My skin felt like ice, and I couldn't feel my fingers. I held Marmalade close to me, and in a last-ditch effort, I flung my phone into the dark. Glass shattered. I'd thrown it through the window next to the little French balcony. A beam of morning light broke through. I turned around to an empty apartment, the layout exactly as I'd remembered it, the kitchenette still running, torn down wallpaper lining the edges of the room, Marmalade's favorite bed still by the window, and the many Chinese takeout boxes still left unattended, just as it should be, except every inch of the room was covered by dry blue flower petals. Needless to say, I didn't stick around for long. I moved out to the branch office where Deirdre worked and ended up staying there. We're still best friends to this day. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people about what happened that night. I get the sense that whatever lived in that dark space was just waiting for someone to tear down that barrier, the hedge of flowers and patterns, something waiting to pull me into a dark space, never to return. Poor Marmalade hasn't been the same ever since. Her fur has turned matted orange, and she's a lot clingier than before. She's okay though. She's a happy cat, but it would be a lie if I say she hasn't changed. The same can be said about me. It's not a single obvious thing, but I feel like there are things about me that aren't the same. My eyes look darker, my fingers look longer, my teeth sharper and wider, just enough for me to notice and remember. In my new place, I sleep with the lights on. I try to not look closely at the wallpaper, just in case. One day, there's no more room in heaven. The pearly gates are closed. All the angels come on down. Come on down. It was just a nursery rhyme my grandfather used to sing. A reminder to be good and to accept things for what they are, instead of needlessly holding on to the superficial. A story of heaven being closed, and even the angels being left outside. I remember asking him once what that world would look like. He stroked my hair, held me tight, and sighed. "You'll see, dear boy," he whispered. "I'm sorry, but you'll see." My grandfather has been gone for a long time now. His ashes were spread on the lavender fields outside of Tomskog, Minnesota. Part of me still gets this sinking feeling when I think about him, and another part of me just hopes he made it through the gates. No, I'm not a very religious person, but a sentence can paint a concept, and a concept can be a powerful thing. Maybe there is no pearly gate in the sky, but maybe there is a sense of peace to experience in our final moments. That's all I can hope for, both for him and for me. All throughout my life, I've had this idea lingering in the back of my mind. It hasn't really affected me in any particular way, but it is something I haven't been able to forget. But some time ago, it became relevant in a way I would never have imagined. I was working at a cafe at the time. Nikki was my closest coworker. We shared every shift, and she was just a beam of light wherever she went. She was half the reason we had as many customers as we did. She was simply a delight, and she made every regular feel seen. She was kind, honest, and genuine. At the end of every shift, she'd ask me not to just have a good one, but to have the best one, a quirk of hers. Then, she had a brain aneurysm. Most people don't survive it, but Nikki did. Maybe it was a mild one. We were all waiting anxiously for an update, and eventually, word came down. Nikki was going to be all right, with little to no permanent damage. She was even going to return to work once her recovery was done. There was a palpable sense of relief in the air, both for us and the regulars. Everything was going to be okay. Of course, that's not what happened. When Nikki came back, she had visibly changed. It wasn't much of a surprise, given what she'd gone through, but it was clear that something drastic had happened. Even at a glance, she'd lost about 20 pounds and must have shaved her head at some point. It had just started to grow back. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and there was a little tilt to her stance. She was hunched over, as if needing to lean on something for support. Still, it was Nikki, and we were all relieved to see her back behind the register, even if her smile was a bit crooked. But there were many changes. They were subtle at first. She would forget the occasional name or spell something wrong. I figured it was just a leftover from her aneurysm, something that would go away over time. She was supposed to make a full recovery after all, but seeing the way her eyes glazed over as she talked to other people, it made me wonder, was she making an honest mistake? Or had she stopped caring? I remember ending a shift with her, and as we closed shop, I waved goodbye. I was expecting her to say something back like she always did, but she didn't. She didn't ask me to have the best one, or even a good one. She just stood there in complete silence, her eyes 1,000 miles away. So instead, I took the initiative. I got back in the cafe, walked up to her, and cleared my throat. "You all right, Nikki?" I asked. "Yeah," she sighed. "I'm good. Great. You seem what?" She turned to me, clearly not interested in discussing the topic further. Expecting an answer, she went quiet. I shrugged it off. "Nothing." I smiled. "You have a good one." "Yeah." And that was that. Over the next few days, I noticed more and more things that were off about her. She would not only forget her regulars, but actively snap back at them. She'd mess up her orders. At one point, she almost broke the microwave in the break room. She just stood there, watching the plate spin as the spoon she'd left in her cup sparkled. She knew it was wrong. She just didn't care. But I didn't say anything, and I didn't step in. Not until I noticed her shortchanging an older man. He owed $6 and handed Nikki a 50. She gave him 34 back, trying to pocket a 10. Skim a little off the top. It was pretty smooth, really. She counted $44, but left the 10 out when she handed the money over. That's when I stepped in, trying my best to make it look like an honest mistake. The old man didn't seem to mind. He'd always liked Nikki. She turned towards me and gave me this look. I'd never seen it before. A joyless smile behind darkened eyes. A look that said she would do her best to ruin my day. "Thank you," she smiled. I would have felt awful. She wouldn't. I don't know how I knew, but I saw it. There was no hint of regret behind that smile. I tried to be sympathetic. I heard about people having personality changes after massive personal trauma. It's to be expected. But Nikki hadn't just changed. It's like I was looking at a stranger. None of her enthusiasm was there. There was a callous disregard, and even disgust, towards the things that made her so wonderful to begin with. But that also gave me a frightening thought. From all the things I'd seen her do, what else was she doing when no one was looking? How far would she go? Given how she'd been ready to scam that old man, did I even want to know? During our next shift, I tested her. I'd come back at irregular times, checking in on her when I thought she wasn't looking. She'd be on her phone, leaving the freezer open, forgetting to lock the back door, and, strangest of all, smoking. I'd never seen her smoke, and all of a sudden, she was doing it in the break room. But the final straw was at the end of the workday, when I saw her pocket money from the register. It was a complete accident that I noticed. I'd gone back to get a napkin and caught her red-handed. We looked at one another across the room. Her face was like a brick wall, but I could see it tremble. It cracked to reveal that joyless smile and those unblinking dark eyes. "You didn't see what you think you saw," she said. "I think I did," I answered. "No, you didn't see shit." She approached me. Even her walk was different. She'd got within arm's reach and put her hands on her hips, tossing an apron over her shoulder. "Who do you think you're talking to?" She smiled. "You think you know me? You think you know this person? Nikki, you've got to stop," I said. "This has to stop." "This has to nothing," she laughed. "And you know why?" She leaned in close. I could hear her bite down, as if forcing her jaw shut. Her voice was spiteful, angry, like she was holding back something terrible. "Because if I hear that you said anything to anyone," Nikki took a step back, letting her cheerful facade fall back into place. And with the same joyful smile as ever, she put up 2 fingers, playful little scissors. Snip, snip. I talked to the manager the next day. I hadn't planned on it, but I couldn't stay quiet. I told her about the threats, the register, the change, the smoking, all of it. I tried to be clear that I cared about Nikki, but that she was harming the place and herself. My manager didn't seem all too surprised. Apparently, others had taken notice as well. She was going to talk to Nikki later that day anyway. I just added fuel to the fire. I felt awful about it, but thinking back on that little snip snip, I didn't even want to begin considering what she would be capable of. There was no way to know anymore. Whatever had happened to Nikki, it had made one thing certain. I had no idea who this person was anymore. She was let go soon after. I wasn't there for it, but my manager was visibly upset afterwards. She didn't want to talk about it, so I can only imagine what had been said behind closed doors. I thought that would be it, but that was only the beginning. The morning of the first shift without Nikki, I was first on site. Right outside the door was a pair of scissors neatly laid out. Next to them were a handful of sunflowers with their heads cut off. They'd been thrown to the side and left in the dirt, turning a bright blue in the process. Didn't know they did that. There was no doubt in my mind that this was a threat, and I could feel an unease settle in my stomach. An ever so light sweat crawled across my skin. Just as I was about to open the door, a thought washed over me. I checked under the handle. noticing a razor blade taped to the back. Had I pushed down on it, I would have cut a gash across my palm. I removed it and told my manager about it, but there was nothing we could do. The security camera for the back area hadn't worked for months, something that Nikki knew all too well. Throughout the day, I couldn't help but wonder what she was going to do next. Maybe nothing. Maybe something downright violent. A threat could just be a threat, but there was something in me telling me that I should take it seriously. This wasn't Nikki anymore. If she was willing to do something this demented day one, what was going to happen on day two? Of course, there were plenty of regulars who asked about her. Most expressed concern, and a couple of them were heartbroken. But what surprised me the most were the ones who were relieved. Apparently, they'd seen something as well. "It's not her anymore," an older woman complained. "It's like she never really came back." Those words stuck with me. Like she never came back. It really felt that way. Sure, people can change, but people like Nikki? For the first time in years, it made me think back to my grandfather. The pearly gates are closed. All the angels come on down. Come on down. For the next few days, the threats were numerous and obvious. A pair of scissors left outside my door, this time accompanied by 2 chestnuts. By lunch, we got a remote order for 3 bagels with the additional comment, "Keep it, it'll be your last meal." With every poke and prod, I was reminded that there was really no telling with this woman. So yeah, unsurprisingly, my manager got the police involved. And from there, it escalated. Fast. They couldn't find Nikki. Her place was an abandoned mess. Her car had been impounded after left in the open street. Her bathroom was splattered with drops of blood, seemingly her own, and she was nowhere to be found. We managed to convince the local sheriff that a patrol car ought to come by and check the shop out every hour or so. But us who worked there seemed to be fair game. There wasn't evidence that Nikki was the one behind it, even if everything pointed to it. Still, the threats were real and treated as such. Mostly, 3 days passed without any incident after that. I was beginning to calm down and, maybe, consider this to be over. There'd been no word of Nikki, and all signs pointed to her having left town. I came home from work, dropped my keys in the bowl, wiped my shoes, and locked the front door. I stashed away some groceries and grabbed a Coke, leaning against the kitchen counter. It had been a long day, and I had a chicken salad ready to make everything better. That, and a guilty pleasure episode of Love is Blind. Don't judge. I stepped into the living room, ready to settle in for the night, when I noticed something. The curtains of my living room window had been moved. I never opened those curtains. I lived on the first floor. I was sitting down when I turned my head towards the bedroom door. My phone was still on the kitchen counter. I couldn't see anyone, but I held my breath. I felt like animal prey, hoping against hope not to be noticed if I just kept still enough. But no, Nikki noticed. The sound gave her away long before I saw her. The snip-snip of a pair of household scissors, followed by that joyless, dead-eyed grin peeking around the corner. I grabbed a vase from the coffee table and got to my feet. At first glance, I couldn't tell if it was Nikki. She'd not only cut her hair, but parts of her face. There was a long slit in her nose reaching almost all the way up to her eyebrows. A couple more nips in her ears, as well as her lip. She didn't seem to mind. If anything, it made her smile harder. "Didn't you get the message?" She grinned, and as if to make a point, she snipped the scissors twice and advanced. It all happened so fast. She jumped over the couch, stepping on the cushions with her raw, bloody feet. She threw herself at me with complete abandon, laughing as she tumbled to the ground, tearing the curtains down as she went. I instinctively threw the vase at her and went for my phone, but there was no way I'd get the chance to call for help. She was after me. Instead, I grabbed the first thing within reach, my salad knife. It struck her in the throat. Nikki recoiled, pulling out the knife. There was a spurt of blood cast across the white and sky blue kitchen tiles. She just got a bigger smile on her face as her eyes locked onto mine. "You still don't know who you're talking to." Her voice had turned to a sickening wheeze as air escaped the hole in her throat. She fumbled her way towards me as her body struggled to stay upright. She pointed the scissors at me. "You don't know." And with that, she collapsed. I grabbed my phone, stepped over her, and tapped in the emergency service number. I was just about to press the call button when an immense pain exploded in my shoulder. Every nerve in the right half of my body felt like it had been set on fire. I dropped my phone as my fingers cramped, spinning around to see what had happened. There was a light drag coming from my shoulder. Something was stuck in it. Nikki was back on her feet, as if nothing had happened, blood still pouring out of her neck. "I'm Kelly," she said in a cheerful tone, crossing her arms behind her back. "What's your name?" "What?" That's all I had the time to say before she attacked again. The scissors that had been lodged in my shoulder fell to the floor, and I ducked her attack to grab them. As I swung around, pushing myself up against the wall for momentum, I attacked her head on, digging the scissors into her left eye. For a second, she was quiet. Her breathing stopped. I could hear my own beating heart and see the pulse rushing through my hands. As a moment passed, she blinked, her right eye unhindered, her left eye pushing against the steel of the scissors. I pushed her away. She should be dead. I'd buried those scissors deep. "Now I'm Emmett," she said. "You should be more careful." A completely different accent and demeanor. She stood up straighter. She adjusted herself, wiping the blood off her cheek. It didn't help. She was bleeding profusely, which seemed to annoy her. She pulled the scissors out, giving me a confused look with her one healthy eye. "Are we killing one another?" She came at me again. I cut her with the shards of my broken vase. Then she said she was Morgan. I cut her with the broken glass from a fallen portrait. And all of a sudden, she was Lillian. I don't know how many times she cut me back. My arms got cut to ribbons, and she managed to get a slice across my cheek that barely missed going into my ear. I stabbed her over and over with everything I could find, taking out her eyes, throat, heart, and lungs. Her stomach looked like a knife block, and still, she was coming at me. "I'm Roy," she gargled. "You're gonna love me." She seemed to literally grow, her arms extended, her legs bending at unnatural angles, snapping to attention as her bones settled into her sockets. She ripped off the power cable from a nearby lamp, biting it loose. She didn't care that it cost her 3 teeth. She wrapped the cable around her hands, ready to strangle. Another tooth drooled its way out of her mouth as I was cornered in the bedroom. I tripped over a chair I kept by my bed, breaking it. An old wooden chair that pretty much came with the apartment. I ended up on my back, looking up at Nikki as she came at me with a childlike enthusiasm, a blood-dripping tongue panting with enthusiasm. I managed to get under my bed, but she wrapped the cable around my foot, dragging me back out, kicking and screaming. She was squeezing my ankle so hard that I thought it was gonna pop off. Then, a siren. The neighbors must have called the police. As Nikki turned her head, I grabbed a chair, heaving myself forward. I managed to get a solid smack across her jaw, causing her to topple over. Pressing my advantage, I crawled on top of her, smacking her with the wooden chair leg over and over and over. "I'm Mark," she said. "I'm Hannah. I'm Benny. I'm Nora. I'm... I couldn't stop, and neither could she. She kept coming back, even after the structure and musculature of her face turned into mush. She kept going, long after her words had turned to sounds. I dropped the chair leg. She was barely even twitching, making some ungodly gagging noises. I didn't even notice I was screaming. Maybe I had been screaming that whole time. It's as if a soul settled back into my body, bringing my actions into perspective. I'd been beating her to death, but death, it just wouldn't come. I could hear sirens coming closer as I wept. Two of her fingers carefully stroked the palm of my left hand as she opened her mouth, and with a Herculean effort, she turned her blind face towards me. "There's nothing," she gargled. "There's nothing." And as those empty eyes locked onto mine, she said her final words. "Come on down." The police broke down the door and pulled me away. I barely even remember where they took me. I was so disassociated that I only remember the lights. A dark corridor, a bright ambulance, a flashlight checking my eyes, distant voices, introductions. I'm nurse this, I'm doctor that, officer, sheriff, all asking 1,000 questions at once, and only one stood out. "Do you understand?" And no, I didn't. They ruled it as a psychotic self-defense episode brought on by the harassment and mania. There were investigations, evaluations, sessions, everything. I think there was a Dr. Bogan somewhere in there. It passed in a blur. I don't think I could think straight for well after a month after that attack. It's like it uprooted something deep and disturbing within me. But over time, well, what else can you do but live? So that's what I did. Now people know me around town as the guy who survived a home invasion, brought on by some kind of stalker woman. I'm okay with that narrative. I don't want to consider what they really ought to call me. What even am I? What was she? I have to stop calling her Nikki. Nikki was long gone. Maybe she never came back to begin with. The scars are still here, but they don't bother me anywhere near as much as those final words. As that eyeless face looked my way, choosing the words that I know only one person would pick. Come on down. For my 31st birthday, my friends got me a heritage DNA test. One of those where you send a sample and get an approximate percentage of what makes up your background. I don't think there was anything in particular that made them gift it to me though. I think they ordered one for themselves and got a 2-for-1 kind of deal. Still, I figured it'd be fun to check out. My biological grandpa died when my dad was very young, and my grandmother remarried long before I was born, so I was never told a lot about that side of the family. I'd always been a bit of a sickly child, so I've been wary about looking too closely at my family and health history. But I figured this couldn't hurt, so I filled out the form, provided the sample, and sent it on its way. Then I just sort of forgot about it. When I finally got the results, it came with a few surprising revelations. While the majority of my heritage was entirely predictable, there was an 11% splash of something called the Northern Scandinavian Blue Hill Tribe. I asked my parents about it. While my mother had no idea what the Blue Hill Tribe was, she was pretty sure it wasn't from her side of the family. My dad was equally confused. Sure, he didn't know much about his biological father, but he knew for a fact that the man was from Oklahoma. His mom, on the other hand, was Minnesotan. Dad got curious and ordered his own test within the hour. As I ended the call and boxed the packaging up, something fell out. A sturdy envelope made with thin navy blue cardboard and sealed with a sunflower emblem. It had a mild chemical smell to it, like a sweet ammonia. At first, I thought it was going to be some kind of special offer, much like what got me that test in the first place. But after turning it over, I could see it was addressed directly to me in handwritten cursive. It read, "Congratulations on your recent result. As part of our further effort to explore the diverse world of unified heritage, and in cooperation with our various multinational partners, we would like to extend an invitation to the descendants of the Northern Scandinavian Blue Hill Tribe for an eventful day of education, connectivity, and celebration. Please consider this invitation and review the enclosed details using your login credentials. We hope to see you there." I didn't know exactly what to make of it, but I decided to check it out. And holy hell, it reeked of a scam. Here's what it offered: a fully paid 3-day stay at a hotel in Manchester, New Hampshire, free entry to the company-sponsored Heritage Celebration event, alongside other members of both the Blue Hill Tribe, but also other unique and diverse backgrounds. There were several groups listed, mostly hailing from the Scandies, the Carpathians, and the Ural Mountains. I would have to pay for the trip to get there, though, and they were clear about food, drink, and other room services not being included. But all in all, it sounded too good to be true. After several hours of trying to find my way through the customer service websites, I finally got a hold of an actual service rep over the phone. At first, they seemed to have no idea what I was talking about. But when I referenced a personal case number at the bottom of the envelope, they referred me to a special events manager. The manager, in turn, confirmed everything. I know, they laughed. "I know how it sounds, but this is actually a sort of golden ticket thing. It's a biannual event and part of a charity effort, so there's a tax incentive for us as well. If you can make it, I'd recommend checking it out. We got some event photos on our website for reference." I did as she suggested, and I gotta say, I was convinced. I accepted. My flight arrived on the morning of the first event day, about 3 hours ahead of opening. I had an uneventful early check-in, spotting the locked doors through the lobby. There were a few posters marking the Heritage Celebration event, and there were already a couple of people roaming the halls outside. But I decided to catch my breath a bit before the doors opened. I got to my room and clocked out for a couple of hours. I double-checked the event schedule on my phone, making mental notes of the various talks, guided tours, luncheons, dinners, and get-togethers. It was a full 2-day event. I was surprised at just how much there was to do, considering the event was intended for no more than a couple of hundred people at most. Still, I couldn't complain. But just as I drifted off for a nap, I got a notification on my phone. A text from my dad. Apparently, he'd recently gotten his results back. Strangely enough, he didn't have any percentage of the Northern Scandinavian Blue Hill Tribe in his genetic makeup. Maybe my mom wasn't as southern as she thought. Once the doors opened, there were about 100 people walking about. Some looked like average Joe nobodies. Others were clearly some kind of corporate representative. I could tell at least 6 different accents just by walking around, and a couple of foreign languages. There were a few booths to check out, mostly advertising various new services and products by the company behind the DNA test, but also one that was just information about various forgotten or unusual tribes. Going through the pamphlets, I couldn't find one about the Blue Hill Tribe, so I decided to ask a service rep behind the counter. Blue Hill?" he said, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not sure I—" Another rep whispered something in his ear, and he nodded. "Right," he corrected. "We don't have any reading material on that subject, but, I think there's an info session. Should be part of the Tribes of the North meetup." I double-checked the schedule again and made my way to a couple of events. The Tribes of the North meetup was an after-dinner event, part of the late-night after-hours socializing thing they tried to get going. I spent the afternoon listening in on various other topics, trying to pass the time. There was a speaker on the topic of nomadic North American tribes. as well as a workshop about forgotten languages. It was all interesting in its own way, but I found myself drifting away just after lunchtime. I had to take a rest around 3 p.m. because of an upset stomach, a relic from my sickly past. Later, I took a walk around town and had a decent meal at a local restaurant before I headed back to the hotel. I was a few minutes late to the meetup. There were about 24 people there in total. We didn't really have any common features. We had different skin, hair, eyes, and we were all from different parts of the US. A couple of them were Canadian, and there was this one guy from the Philippines. It was pretty clear who the event organizer was, though. A chipper young woman in a black pantsuit with a company logo pin and a digital clipboard. She went around the room, confirming that everyone was a member of the Blue Hill. I overheard an older woman mentioning she was categorized as over 30%, while a young man mentioned he only had 5%. The young woman cleared her throat and excused herself, calmly demanding the attention of the room. "Thank you all so much for coming," she smiled. "I'm sure you have 100 questions, and we thought this might be a good time to get to know one another a little better. Please, follow me." We were led through a corridor to a smaller open room, a sort of meeting space in the back. They turned down the lights a bit and set out a couple of platters of cheese, crackers, and some alcohol-free sparkling wine. There were a couple of people there already. I was about to spark up a conversation with the 50-year-old man who looked as confused as me, when the chipper young woman took a hold of the room again. She directed our attention to a man that I can't for the life of me remember the name of. Weston or Wesley, I think. He, in turn, welcomed us and encouraged us to indulge in the various snacks scattered throughout the room. Then, he introduced us to the topic of the evening, the Blue Hill Tribe. "If there is one thing I'm certain of," he stated, "is that every single person in this room has had a serious medical condition at some point in their life. Something unusual. Does anyone mind sharing an example?" I didn't speak up about the severe ulcers I had as a kid and the partial transplant I had to get, but there were others who openly shared various issues. Heart valve issues, cornea transplants, nerve damage. Everyone seemed to have something. The man just nodded, as if expecting this. This is, sadly, a common attribute of people with lineage dating back to the Blue Hill tribes. So let's take a closer look at the history and customs of these unique people. And while we do, please feel free to mark yourself in the attendance sheet. He continued to speak of a group of people, native to the northern Scandinavian mountain ranges. There were dates, locations, an approximate number of tribal members, and a few other sparse details. I marked the form while I waited, realizing pretty early on that what he was saying was suspiciously generic. He spoke of leather and bone craftsmanship and a belief in mountain spirits, but there were no details, no references, no pictures, drawings, or artifacts. I noticed a lot of people around the room paying close attention and not really thinking too much about what they were filling out on the attendance sheet. But I took a closer look. Our names were already on the sheet, so we were only supposed to make a check mark. However, there were also percentages printed on the side, corresponding to the percentage of heritage we had in common with this tribe. I recognized my 11% and the 30% of the old woman. There was also a series of other numbers that I didn't immediately recognize. When I thought no one was looking, I snapped a picture of it, just in case. After a 15-minute lecture on the history of the Blue Hill tribe, I came to the realization that I hadn't actually learned anything. The locations and dates were so generic that there was no way to fact-check it, and there were no details as to their various customs and crafts. Looking around the room, I noticed the chipper young woman off in the corner, whispering to someone on her Bluetooth earpiece, her eyes scanning the crowd with a serious demeanor. There was a man in a suit by the doorway taking pictures with his phone. and a hotel functionary offering refreshments being turned away. This was clearly a private matter, and of great interest to the company. For some reason, I snapped to attention as the room applauded. The lecture came to an end, and we were given some time to mingle, but not without another reminder to make a mark on the attendance sheet. I chatted for a bit with a few people, but it all felt a bit forced. Just a few words here and there. I got the impression that none of us had very much in common. No one seemed to have any idea where that part of their heritage actually came from. There was this one guy who had studied his genealogy extensively, who insisted that it was strictly impossible for him to be even partly Scandinavian. "I've mapped out every family member for 6 generations," he scoffed. "There's no way." As more and more people filtered out into the night, I decided to lag a bit to see what was being said behind closed doors. I wasn't sneaking around on all fours like a spy, just lingering a little too long on the other side of a bathroom door, or stopping to conveniently check my email near a hushed conversation. I picked up a few bits and pieces. Discussions about our percentages, for example. There was also talk about a second event the following night, and how it wasn't officially on the schedule. They referred to it as sort of a closing ceremony. There was also a short talk about inviting a few of us to a private meeting. I heard 2 people squabbling a bit about the details, and I didn't catch much of it, but I clearly heard a sentence as they finished. "Just get the ripe ones," one of them snarled. "None of that 3% shit." I didn't like that. Not one bit. Returning to my room, I decided to pack up my things. I had a bad feeling about whatever they were up to, and I couldn't help but to imagine that they had something planned. Maybe it was all a scam after all, or something worse. Either way, I wasn't eager to find out. I couldn't find a decently priced flight back home until early morning. It was almost 12 hours away, but I figured I could pull an all-nighter and get out as soon as the sun rose. I could wait a few hours at the airport if need be. With my bags packed and ready, I settled in for a long night. It was somewhere around 2 a.m. when I found myself staring at late-night TV and scrolling on my phone. As the salesman prattled on in the background, a stray thought hit me. I decided to take another look at the attendance sheet photo. There was a set of numbers by each person that didn't make immediate sense to me. I brought out a pen and paper and started breaking them down. First in sets of 2, then individually, then sets of 3. Trying to make some pattern or idea. It took me a little longer than I care to admit to recognize something. The last 4 numbers correlated to one pattern. Floor and room number. That left 4 other numbers, which, when broken down into pairs of 2, correlated to a month and day. The date itself didn't make much sense though. For me, it was just a few days after I'd sent in my first sample. Then it hit me. It was probably the day they received the sample. Taking a closer look at the percentages, I could see that everyone with a 9% heritage or lower, they were situated on lower floors, while those with 10% and higher all seemed to have higher. Maybe there was a sort of unspoken threshold happening at 10% and up. Could that be what they referred to when they said get the ripe ones? As I scrolled through the various images of previously hosted charity events, I got a notification. My phone warned me that my camera app had unexpectedly closed. Strange, seeing as how it wasn't open to begin with. I had a bad feeling settled in my stomach. I was on the hotel Wi-Fi. Could they be monitoring our activities? I considered the option that I was just being tired and paranoid. That might very well be the case. But on the other hand, I'd heard what I'd heard. It was stressing me out, further upsetting my already sensitive stomach. I could feel a tinge of pain and decided to go get some ice. Might sound like a stupid home remedy thing, but sucking on an ice cube has always helped me calm down. I followed the corridor, got myself some ice and a bucket, and returned to my room. As I was about to round the corner, I recognized a familiar sound, my hotel room door being closed and locked from the outside. Peeking around the corner, I noticed two people dressed in black disappearing down the hall, mumbling quietly to one another. Returning to my room, I couldn't help but second-guess myself. Had the bathroom door always been open? Was the same channel on the TV playing? Had someone moved my bags? It was hard to tell. That's how I spent the night, wondering. My heart sometimes skipped a beat as I thought I noticed something new. But ultimately, I couldn't find anything immediately threatening. I pulled out my phone battery, just in case, and kept it in my other pocket. No one would be tracking me anytime soon. I messed up my bed to make it look like I had slept in it, even though I spent most of my time in the bathroom, ready to lock the door and call the police. I nodded off a few times, but eventually, the sun broke the horizon. A few rays of sunshine slipping in through the frosted bathroom window. I got my bags and left. One nervous elevator ride later, I slapped down the hotel key on the reception and headed for the exit without elaborating. I accidentally made eye contact with the hotel security guard by the exit, who gave me a curious side eye. "Sir?" he asked. I stopped, briefly, and excused myself. He held up a hand. "Sir, may I speak with you?" he repeated. "I have an appointment," I smiled. "Sorry." "It won't take long," he smiled. "Right this way." Looking at the silver-colored revolving door that could get me out of there, I considered my options. I could make a break for it, or I could just see what this was about. I decided to just talk to the man, banking hard on it not being anything serious. In hindsight, I should have gone for the goddamn door. I was taken to a small room right next to the reception. There, he asked to see my phone. I showed him, although the battery was still out. "My supervisor had a couple of questions," he said. "He's just outside, won't be a minute." "I'm sorry, but I gotta..." He pocketed my phone, smiled, and stepped out of the room. But it wasn't an ordinary service personnel kind of smile. It was almost apologetic, like he knew he'd landed me in some kind of trouble. And through the door came the young chipper woman from the previous night. She wasn't as chipper this time. She didn't sit down, instead opting to stand on the opposite side of the room with her arms crossed. For a solid minute, she just stood there, considering what to say. Finally, she let out a sigh and took a step forward. I felt like a scorned schoolboy being dragged to the principal's office. "Are you leaving early?" she asked. "Would be a shame for you to miss the get-together tonight." "I'm thankful to have a part of this," I said, "but I really ought to get going." "Oh?" She feigned surprise. "Family emergency?" "That's private," I said. I could still hear hotel personnel outside, and figured she didn't want to make a scene. I leaned back in my chair, confident and quiet. She didn't take that too well. "I think it would be best if you stayed a little longer," she continued. "I don't think I will." "Well, I don't think there's much to debate." "I'm sorry, but you have no..." She slammed her fist on the table and stared down at me, unblinking and furious. There was a slight tremble in her movement. There was no way those outside didn't hear us, and yet, no one moved a muscle. Perhaps she was in more control than I'd anticipated. "I think you're gonna stick around for a while," she snarled, "or we're gonna have a problem. You wanna have a problem with me?" "No," I said, shaking my head. I don't." "Then you're gonna shut the fuck up and play along." I was dumbstruck. There was no ambiguity here. She was outright threatening me. I could barely understand why. Maybe she'd seen something on my phone while I was connected to the hotel Wi-Fi. Or maybe they noticed me spying. Perhaps they saw me pondering the attendance sheet. I don't know. Either way, They weren't taking any chances. I didn't see that hotel security guard again. Instead, they put me in a room with a very quiet man in a suit. He didn't answer any questions. He wasn't much for small talk. All he did was stand outside the room, checking in on me as soon as I made a noise. I spent all day in that room. The small 10 by 14 feet room with little more than a couch, a coffee table, and the most generic looking hotel painting I'd ever seen. Still, as calming as that room was, I was freaking the fuck out. But there was nothing for me to do at that point. No harebrained schemes could make me magically phase through the wall. I was stuck there, and I sure as hell wouldn't fight that guy. Didn't take a detective to spot that he was armed. The stress made my stomach act up. I was allowed to use the bathroom, but they kept the stall door open. Then it was straight back to the room. I tried frantically to come up with some kind of plan, or figuring out some specific turn of the corridor where he wouldn't have a clear shot, but it was useless. There were long, wide open spaces and no harsh corners, but that was my mindset. I was still under the impression that there was something I could do, but in reality, I couldn't. Once that started to dawn on me, I realized how screwed I was. It was the emotional equivalent of sinking into a deep black ocean. It was late afternoon when the door opened. Having spent most of the day napping on the couch and anxiously wandering back and forth, I got on my feet like a soldier. One of the guards coaxed me outside. I could tell something was up. People were rushing past us, speaking into their earpieces. We moved in the opposite direction, but I caught a glimpse of well-dressed people used as human shields for someone very important. I was quickly ushered along. I was taken through the hotel kitchen. They'd cleared out the staff. They took me to what looked like an abandoned old walk-in freezer. I was pushed inside, and the door was closed. I don't know how those walk-in freezers are supposed to work, but this one locked from the outside. There were no lights, and I could barely make out what was happening through the little windows. I didn't have to wait for long. Just minutes later, I could hear other people entering the room. Some curious, some angry, some crying. One by one, the guests from the previous night were ushered into the freezer. Even the old woman. Well, not all the guests. Only those ripe enough. There were 9 of us in total. Some were mildly annoyed. Others were confused. Finally, they dropped a guy who had been beaten straight onto the floor. He was clearly not okay, trying his best to breathe through his mouth. That set most of us off. Some banged on the door. Others screamed at the top of their lungs. No one had a phone or a weapon. The panic rose, and it spread like wildfire. Soon, I was right there with them, screaming for someone to let us out. I screamed my voice hoarse, but no one came. We must have been in there for at least 40 to 45 minutes. Our protest died, and in the following silence, we heard someone enter the room. A single set of footsteps. They approached, and we all quieted down. I could see the vague outline of a man outside, but our breaths fogged up the windows on the door. He had a black suit with a blue tie. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching us. I backed away from the door, and the others did the same. No matter how bad the freezer was, there was something telling me that this guy was somehow worse. He was too calm, like this was all normal. He'd done it before. As the door opened, we all scrambled to get back. He stepped into the entrance, obscured by the bad lighting, but for all I could see, he was a man, a little shorter than me, a bit round around the stomach, bald, maybe glasses. There was something reflecting off his face, and yet, there was something about him that screamed danger. The man who had been beaten was ready to roll the dice. He took off running, trying to push past and get out. There was a kitchen exit not too far away, so if he could just make it past this guy, then maybe he'd be in the clear. But no, he didn't get far. The strange man didn't tackle him or attack him or scream. In fact, he didn't seem to react at all. But the runner, well, he stopped a few steps short of leaving the freezer. He clutched his throat, gasping for air. The strange man spoke in a raspy, matter-of-factly voice, as if counting the inventory on a supermarket shelf. Male, 38 years old. 6 years spread reaching a total of 18%. Implant through esophagus surgery. And then, there was this ungodly noise. The runner collapsed to his knees. He was trying to scream, but all that came out was a sort of guttural wheeze. It escaped him in waves, involuntarily, until we could see something poking out of his mouth, like the silhouette of a wet branch being pulled out. Finally, there was a snap, as it fully dislodged, and the freezer began to reek of blood. He stopped moving. The panic consumed us. I may read calm here in the aftermath, but in that moment, I was an animal. I was scratching on the fucking walls trying to get back. I didn't care if I was pushing people to the floor or stepping on someone's head. I was desperate. The strange man spoke again, but this time, his raspy voice seemed better, improved. Female, 29 years old. 4 years spread reaching a total of 14%. Implant through spinal surgery. One by one, he counted us off. Male, female, male, female. 4 years, 5 years, 9, 8. Percentages going up and down. Lung cancer, cornea implant, dialysis, screams and blood. One by one being pulled out of the crowd, and then pulled apart. I'll never forget the sounds. Small bones sound like carrots when being snapped. Bigger ones, it differs. The dripping noise is human spillage mixed on the floor. Drops of blood really do sound heavier than water. And with every victim, I could see something shift in our captor. Straighter back, deeper breaths. Like he was absorbing it all into himself. Taking something back. Harvesting. The sixth person on the chopping block was me. He read it all out loud. Male, he began. 31 years old. 24 years spread reaching a total of 11%. Implant through ulcer treatment. My stomach rumbled, moved, twitched, as if coming alive. It wanted to escape me, to break free. It strained against me. I collapsed to the floor, my hands slipping on the blood, seeping into my skin, itching under my fingernails. Then, I felt something move in my pocket. I almost dropped it. I still had my phone battery. I took it out and held it up to my mouth. I could bite down on it, drenching myself in acid, or God knows what. My stomach ceased moving, if only for a short reprieve. I looked up at my captor. See? See this? I said. It'll fuck us both up. But you need it, right? You need me whole? There was no response. I could just see him tilting his head down at me. Yeah, if I destroyed myself, you get nothing, right? That's it, isn't it? Huh. I placed it between my teeth, ready to bite down like a rabid dog on a juicy bone. He didn't move as I got up. We circled one another. He wasn't about to let me go. He wasn't looking me in the eyes. He was staring intently at my stomach. He wanted to pull it out of me, to turn it into something else. Or maybe it was part of him all along. Something coming home. No, he said. It ends. He reached out a hand for me, and I bit down without hesitation. To my surprise, there was just a little puff, but that was it. The battery tumbled to the floor, useless. The man instinctively recoiled, but upon seeing that there was no danger, it all came back with a vengeance. The pain was immediate and incredible. Something moved in me, and I immediately spat up a glob of stomach acid. Then, the battery exploded. It wasn't a big explosion, just a loud bang, like the starting pistol of a race. I slipped and slid my way out of the freezer and had to make a split-second decision. I could close and lock the door behind me, effectively sealing him and everyone else in there, or I could leave the door open for others to escape. But it wasn't really a choice. Not really. It never is when you get pushed into something like this. I slammed that door shut and let it auto-lock without even thinking about it. Perhaps he'd asked the guards to clear out. I don't know. But there was no one else in that kitchen. I grabbed a knife from one of the counters, burst through the exit door, and disappeared into the night. My stomach stirring like a restless animal, but settling as I got further away. I can only regret what happened to those left behind. It still makes my fucking spine itch. A police patrol found me wandering the streets about an hour or two later. I can't imagine it looked good. I was taking such small, shallow breaths, and I was still clutching a kitchen knife, not to mention, I was covered in blood. They were convinced that I'd killed someone, but I surrendered willingly and eagerly. I tried to tell a coherent story, but they just didn't understand me. I probably didn't make much sense. A shower and a fresh set of clothes later, I explained my experience at the hotel to the best of my ability. Sadly, it didn't really do much. There were no records of the man I'd described ever visiting that hotel. As for the missing people, those I claimed had been murdered. They had checked out one by one at different hours of the day prior. According to hotel records, they might be missing, but there was no indication of foul play. Yeah, I'm calling bullshit on that. So yeah, that was by far the worst time of my life. Looking back at it, it feels unreal, like it happened to someone else. But even now, I can still get little flashes of something that reminds me of that night, and it just pulls me right back. It never really leaves. Whoever that man was, he was important enough to get a whole company to cover for him. I'm not sure all of them knew what they were doing, but they were complicit. I think we're looking at someone with a lot of resources and a lot of reach. I never got a name, and seeing as how he seemed to change with every victim he consumed, I can't really tell what he looks like anymore, not even his age or height or weight. There are, surprisingly, some real records about a small tribe of people from the Blue Hill in the Scandinavian mountain range. There isn't much out there about them, just to mention that they worshipped immortal mountain spirits. Others say they worship devils. It's a mixed bag. I don't know what to believe. I don't know what I saw, but I am living with the knowledge that a part of me, something inside me, isn't my own. It moves with me. It lives with me. But at the snap of a finger from that thing, and it will rebel. It will fail me. And I'm just at, what, 11%? What happens when I reach 50, 100? I decided to post this today, after getting a video ad that I could never have anticipated. It seems that this company is still in business, advertising their new generation of DNA tests. I'm sure some of you out there have seen it. 20 seconds, unskippable, smiling faces, distant families being tied together by a CGI blue ribbon. I think they have some of those damn sunflowers in the background, still colored that basic company blue. And seeing it like that, it made my stomach turn. A few years ago, I was invited to a dinner party. It wasn't that fancy, just a few old friends reconnecting. People I hadn't seen since high school. Some of the names on that list were people I hadn't seen or heard of for years, so it'd be a nice opportunity to catch up. My wife couldn't come though, invites only. She didn't mind. I was really looking forward to it. I dug out my old Tomskog High baseball cap and went through the guest list. There were a few names I recognized at the drop of a hat, and a few that I didn't. I figured some people had changed names over the years. While it wasn't a proper reunion, but more like a get-together of old friends, I still got the sense that there was something more to it. There was no anniversary coming up, so it sort of came out of nowhere. I got the impression that maybe something else was up, like a proposal or some other sort of announcement. The big night took place on a Saturday at a rented venture just outside of town. Some old clubhouse. Nothing big or fancy, but enough to house the 8 partygoers that had pressed the "I will attend" button. I got there a bit early, dressed up in my favorite jacket, sporting the classic baseball cap. It smelled a bit like mildew, but what the hell? If there was ever a time to wear it, this was it. Rolling up to the house, the first person I ran into was the host herself, Jerry, short for Geraldine. She was the de facto head of the AV club back in high school. The elected president of the club was often missing or off doing their own thing, leaving Jerry to take care of the practicalities. If there was one person I'd bet on to arrange a night like this, it would be her. She swept me up in a big hug, pulling a little on my baseball cap. "Oh, we bringing out the big guns, huh?" She laughed. "I should have kept my club sweater. Gotta represent the Togs." The stupid name we used for the locals. It was still around. Over time, the others dropped in. Nellie, the overachiever, Oliver or Ollie, who was on the student council, Chris and Corey, the twins, Omar, who didn't move in until the final year, but instantly made himself a part of the group. Finally, we just waited for Tess. It was getting late, so we figured she could catch up later. We had a couple of drinks and got snacking on some appetizers. Jerry had arranged for a catered meal. It didn't take long for us to fall back into our old roles, finding our way back to each other like we'd never left. There is a saying that the better you know someone, the less you need to talk to them. It really is true. It was just a matter of minutes before we were right back where we left things, all those years ago. But Tess was a no-show. I figured she'd run into some sort of last-minute issue, but Jerry wasn't convinced. If anything, Jerry was being a bit strange about it. Avoidant. Halfway through the main course, Nellie checked her phone. She fell silent all of a sudden. It was hard to tell, since everyone else was laughing and chatting about, but I saw her lift her hand to her mouth, and her eyes stopped blinking. She'd seen something. Something shocking. I gently elbowed Omar next to me, who noticed the same thing. Once the two of us quieted down, so did the others. It didn't take long for the entire table to notice. Nellie looked up at us. There's been an accident. I think Tess is not." She sniffled, putting down her phone. She buried her face in her hands, trying her best to hold back the tears. Everyone picked up their phones, trying to see if what she had said was true, checking the local news, social media, anything. But I kept my eyes on Jerry. She was unusually quiet about this. It didn't take long for the room to devolve. Nellie was openly weeping. Ollie just went pale, staring into the wall. Chris and Corey started arguing about the details, as they differed from one source to the next. Omar just shook his head, over and over, trying to convince himself it wasn't true. But of course, it was. Turns out, Tess had some kind of aneurysm earlier that day, out like a light the moment she sat down in her car. Completely unavoidable and undetectable. It just took some time for people to notice, since it looked like someone just sitting in their car. But Jerry just sat there, sipping her wine. She didn't look at her phone, and she didn't join the conversation. There was a little shake to her hand, like she was suddenly nervous. I wanted to pull her aside and ask her about it, but there was no space. People were talking over one another, calling out, demanding my attention. All the while, Jerry didn't move a muscle. Then, the power went out. It was completely dark. For a moment, all I could see were faces lit up by smartphone screens like ghastly apparitions. I joined in, and so did Jerry. The discussion just died as we all looked at one another. At some point, someone turned their phone towards the table, as if looking for something. As the light panned across the room, we all noticed, in unison, a shape. It was there for only a fraction of a second. Something tall, dark and spectral. Arms that reached all the way to the floor. Something sickly thin and black as oil. There was a shrill screech, like the cables inside the walls were burning, screaming for help. This high-pitched burn, something overloading, bathing the room in a smell of burnt plastic and gypsum. In the blink of an eye, the power returned, and with it, the dark disappeared. The room erupted. Nellie was on her feet, backing away from the table. Ollie crouched down. The twins just stood up, looking lost. Omar just froze, not knowing what to do. But my eyes landed on Jerry, and what she was doing. She just sat there, staring at the space where the dark thing had stood. As the room fell silent, I caught her attention. "What is going on?" I wheezed. What was that?" Jerry shook her head. As the rest of the room turned their attention to her, she began stuttering. Her eyes shifted from one to the next, until she finally gave in. It's hard to explain." So now, we got the real story. It started a couple of months ago. It started with a woman named Gwen. She had been an acquaintance at best, someone that most of the group hadn't interacted with much. She was part of another clique in a way, and there wasn't much crossover between the groups. She had suddenly passed, leaving some former classmates devastated. Tess had heard about it somewhere in her social peripheral. One post in particular had stood out. In one of the memorial comment sections, someone mentioned, she knew this was coming. She'd seen the specter of death. She told me, and I think she was at peace. After that, there'd been 2 more deaths, a man and a woman, both dropping dead within a month of one another. Again, vague hints to seeing something and a specter, but this time, Tess knew them a little better. In fact, she talked to one of them just weeks ahead of their death. 2 things became apparent. 1, that they were being followed by something. 2, that they knew their time was running short. By that 3rd death, Tess figured it was no longer a coincidence. Their old friends were dropping like flies. She reached out to Jerry to kind of get the gang together to talk about it, but only days ahead of the reunion, she'd started to see the specter herself. "She wanted us to go ahead, with or without her," said Jerry. "She knew this would happen." "So what does it mean?" Nellie asked. "We all saw it. Are we all next?" Jerry just shook her head as the questions rained. "What the hell is that?" yelled Corey. "Were you gonna tell us?" Chris joined in. Question after question after question. Finally, Jerry just slumped into her chair, still shaking her head. "I don't know," she repeated over and over. I just don't know." Ollie was the first to react. He headed for the door. "I'm getting the fuck out of here," he yelled. "Fuck this." The moment he opened the door, the power was cut again. My phone was glowing hot in my hand, overloaded by static electricity. All the illuminated faces flickered as our phones struggled to stay alive. In the vague flicker from our phone screens, I only caught a glimpse of it, a figure so tall we couldn't see the head as it loomed outside the door. An impossibly long arm reached in. Ollie just screamed, devolving into a series of ever-repeating no, no, no's, until he was silenced. It took longer for the lights to return now. When they did, Ollie was curled up on the floor like a dying bug, face frozen in surprise and horror. He was already pale as limestone. His eyes glazed over, a single tear in the corner of his frozen eye, dead as a doornail. The room erupted into panic. Jerry screamed at them to stop. The twins headed for the back door, only for the lights to go out again. I heard a bulb pop from the fridge, and I could smell something burning. The scene played out as if through a strobe light. As light bulbs struggled to come back to life, little snapshots of chaos burned into my retinas. Chris dropped immediately in the doorway. Corey made it all the way back to the dinner table before he collapsed, an impossibly long arm touching the back of his head. He fell haphazardly forward, breaking the two legs at the short end of the table. He pulled down most of the tablecloth, along with the plates and glasses. Carefully prepared mimosas and half-drunk wine bottles spilled onto the floor, mixing with froth and dust. He was dead before he hit the ground. Omar panicked, but Nellie managed to hold him back. Jerry was hiding in the corner. I was just standing there like a deer in headlights, trying to remember how to breathe. I had never been the one with a fight or flight instinct. I froze. I froze completely. It took 2 minutes for the first light to come back up. It was the longest 2 minutes of my life. The room was a mess, and we were all too scared to move, like we could be stepping on a landmine. We looked at one another, everyone thinking the same thing. What the hell was this? And why were we being targeted? "Jerry, you have to know something," said Nellie. You just gotta, please. That's why Tess wanted this, so we could figure it out together. So we have something in common, right? Is it that we all turned 30 last year? "I'm older than you," Omar said, shaking his head. It can't be that." "Do we all just have some sickness?" asked Jerry. "Like a genetic thing?" Nellie shook her head. "I have to do regular checkups for work," she said. "I got a clean bill." We went through a checklist of things, trying to figure out an answer to why us. It was the only thing we could do. Our phones were dead, and no one dared to leave. We just stood there, our thoughts running away from us at the speed of panic. It didn't make sense. We were different genders, backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions. We had different occupations, aspirations, hopes, and dreams. For all intent and purposes, we were wildly different people. The only thing tying us together was our association with one another and our shared time at Tomskog High. At one point, we all curled up against the walls. I hugged my knees close to my chest. I couldn't look at Jerry without my eyes crossing paths with Corey's body, curled up like a dead bug, fingers twisted and turned in a painful final expression. I opted just not to look at her, instead speaking generally to the room. "So that's it then," I said. "There's no reason, we're just fucked. We try to leave and we're fucked." "That can't be it," said Omar. "Then why wait? Why not just kill us?" "None of this makes any sense," muttered Nellie, shaking her head. "Why now?" That was a good question. We considered what we'd been doing in our lives lately. I mentioned moving into a new house with my wife, who started a new job as a realtor. Nellie talked about accepting a position in Minneapolis. Omar was moving to South Dakota to be with his sick mother. Jerry had been working remotely for a company in Dallas for years, and only recently they decided to enforce a return to office policy. There were no obvious patterns. Relationships, families, jobs. It all looked very different. Omar tried a different approach. "Maybe it's more practical," he said. "Maybe we have to leave as a group." "Why?" "I don't know. I don't even know what it is." "So let's look at it rather than us. Let's look at what it's doing. I said. "It's keeping us here. It wants us to be here. We're safe now, right?" We all looked around, as if to make a point. We were, indeed, safe. For now. But despite it all, no matter how much logic we tried to apply to it, I couldn't wrap my brain around what we'd been looking at. Some kind of otherworldly entity tearing through us without any kind of retaliation. Or maybe there was. Nellie argued that we should attack it. We'd seen it. So it was some kind of physical entity. It had a shape, a form. That in itself should mean that it could be destroyed. Slowly getting off the floor, we looked at what we had. A few broken table legs as clubs. Jerry figured we could try using salt, as it was supposed to have some sort of supernatural properties on non-worldly entities. Omar figured trying a cross wouldn't hurt. We armed ourselves to the best of our abilities, figuring we would try something as a group. If it really was a physical entity, that meant it was constrained by its own properties, meaning it couldn't catch all of us at once. So instead of moving as a pile of pigs to the slaughter, we would spread out, scattering to the wind. It was risky, but it was all we had. Omar positioned himself by the front door with the table leg. Jerry got the back door with the frying pan. Nellie and I took windows on the opposite sides of the room, she armed with another table leg, while I used a roast pan as a shield and a kitchen knife. We reviewed the plan again. We would go on 5, heading in different directions. Once out, we would be calling for help. If confronted by the entity, we would be using what we had to force it back just enough to run. We hadn't seen it move much, so maybe it wasn't that fast. It was a risky, stupid plan, but we were desperate. Nellie counted down from 5. I held my hand on the window, watching the others follow suit. As the countdown continued, I could feel the strength in my arm wane, like everything in me just wanted not to run, but to crawl into a corner and just wait. And yet, the countdown reached 0. Nellie flung the window open. Omar kicked the front door open. Jerry pushed into the back door, and me. I realized my window was locked. The reaction was immediate and violent. Out of every window and every door, dozens of shade-like appendages appeared. Knife-sharp, bone-like fingers reached for us. The windows were blown apart by the pressure, covering me in 100 little cuts, shattered pieces of glass burrowing into my hair. I didn't fight. That instinct just wasn't there. I scrambled backwards, doing exactly what my instinct taught me to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Omar fought. Nellie too. Jerry actually managed to hit something. I could hear the thwonk of the frying pan, but it was quick. No screams. As the lights died, I saw Jerry's head being grasped as she was dragged outside. Her heart stopped before she even dropped the frying pan. Nellie got halfway across the room before they got her, making her face plant into the hardwood floor in a morbidly comical manner. An entire life snuffed out, ending with an embarrassingly self-inflicted nothing. Omar just stood there as one of those things loomed over him. It reached for him, and he did nothing. It was calm, collected, even reverent in a way. But as what looked like a thumb approached his forehead, he started shaking his head. No, he pleaded. No, I can't. Not like this. And with that, he fell to the floor. Empty. They made no sound. Dozens upon dozens of specters pulled into the room, surrounding me. I wanted to scream, but my breath was stuck in my throat. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was so far from the world I knew that it started to feel like a bad dream. It simply couldn't be well and truly real. But feeling that cold hardwood floor against my cheek made me think differently. I looked up, only to see the specters looming over me, so tall that its head cut through the ceiling. It reached for me, a thumb-like appendage reaching for my forehead, and in that moment, it spoke to me. Less of a voice and more of a series of impressions. It's hard to explain. It showed me flashes of a life, me settling down with my wife, growing little blue sunflowers in the backyard, having kids, growing old, and dying on a park bench near Frog Lake, never leaving the little Minnesota town where I'd grown up. A long, peaceful, and uneventful life. Little spots of sunshine and joy along a gray path, one I'd willingly bind myself to. But then it showed me something else. A different world, full of dark shapes in an endless desert of black sand. There, I wandered as another faceless thing, saying nothing, doing nothing, and there was no end. Burning hellscapes, where my flesh would reform as fast as it melted from my bones in a perpetual cycle of pain. In another place, I was stuck in an empty starless void, where my being was spread among dying stars, eternally drifting. In another, I was floating on a sensationless ocean, staring up at a night sky, where a single red eye, the size of a moon, stared back. I was a consciousness bound to a stage of life I could never break free from. It was an invitation. They were asking me to stay here, there, and forever. That's what had killed the others. They had wanted to leave. I finally understood. I wasn't running. I wasn't leaving. I was staying in this town, while the others had been eager to settle elsewhere. But this invitation wasn't just about me, and the here and now. This was about an endless multitude of existences waiting to happen, one where an end was not promised, a perpetual me, bound to whatever form necessary. Like them, like all of them. I could feel myself shaking my head into a no. I could feel my tongue licking the roof of my mouth, looking to push out that N, but I couldn't. I froze. Yes, I cried. Yes. Of course. A cold thumb touched me, as if drawing an invisible mark across my forehead. And that was it. One by one, they left. They gained what they came for. A recruit. Someone to stay with them. To join their group at an unfathomable cost. The final one left with a breeze, knocking over my Tomskog High baseball cap. Home of the Togs. I just stood there, alone. Contorted remains of people I used to know littered the floor. Husks. The lights came back on, phones buzzing across the room, pings from missed calls and messages. But after all the notifications died down, all that was left was me, sobbing on the floor, doomed. You might have heard about all of this, but in another way. They blamed it all on wine poisoning. There was a sham investigation. I think something around 2,000 bottles were recalled. Not a single soul believed my testimony, and my lawyer recommended me to retract my official statement, as it would either send me to a madhouse or get me in legal trouble. Perjury, maybe. Instead, I said that I simply didn't drink any wine, that I had settled for a beer. That in itself was a lie, but everyone was willing to believe it. Perhaps they all knew there was more to it. Perhaps they didn't care. A few years down the line now, I have 2 daughters. I have a nice job. My wife and I get along well, caring for the house together. It's a good life, but I still can't help but get that nagging feeling that I've doomed myself, that there is something waiting for me that I can't come back from, that maybe, at the end of all this, I am the one getting the raw deal, and not the shriveled up corpses that I left behind in the clubhouse. They say that you never really leave the small town life, that it follows you through your life, one way or another. I never thought it would be this literal. I'm not too sure how to start this. I'm a 22-year-old man who has been bedridden for the past year and a half. My spleen and kidney are gone. As a result, I'm bedridden for a large portion of the day and live with my parents. It's been a pretty depressing life ever since my 21st birthday back in May. I live in southwestern rural Massachusetts and haven't been able to fully participate in my life recently. It sucks, but I guess I'm just lucky to be alive. At this point, you're all probably confused as to what I'm writing. I needed somewhere to warn people, to write down the experience I had on my birthday that night in 2016. It was a late night out with the boys. We were out at the bar in town having a good time up until 1 a.m. It was my birthday, May 14th. I was the last one to be dropped off at home. Our designated driver and I were having a chat about plans for the 4th of July. He missed my street. He said he would turn around at the next chance, and I told him to just pull out of someone's driveway. Unluckily for us, the next house never had anyone home, and I now know why. The house was a dark, dreary color. It was the kind of house that shouted old but still looked like it was in a decent condition. There was always a truck in the driveway, but it hasn't been touched for years, and the lights are never on. I told our driver John to pull into the driveway. I knew the house owner was almost never home, and so he complied. As John drove up the driveway, I couldn't help but let my eyes wander in boredom. I've never actually studied the lot, but everything seemed weirdly well kept for the local ghost house. Believe me, people never saw the house owner here, but the place was always tidy. Rumors flew around saying that it was a local drug house, or that it belonged to some sort of underground cult looking to stone itself in northern New England. Boy, were those rumors wrong. Funnily enough, I would have preferred to be assaulted by a drug lord compared to the experience I had. John looked at the house and jokingly said we should get out of here before the satanic cult gets us. My eyes suddenly snapped to the window. I saw two glowing orbs pointed right at our direction, covered up by a window curtain. At first, I ruled it out to be nothing but a possible window decoration, but in my near-drunken stupor, I couldn't help but panic. As John turned, the light from the headlights, it slowly revealed the figure standing behind those orbs. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. A horror movie creature, too real to be mistaken as a hoax. Its eyes gigantic and reflective, taking in the entire scene of the two passengers in front of it, one frightened, the other ignorant of its existence. It had a humanoid shape with long, slender arms. What looked like spikes ran down along its spine, and the thing looked starved. I could see its rib cage jutting out from its skin. Even from my position at the bottom of the driveway, its bald head seemed too small for the pair of eyes it domed. It stood completely still, staring at me. I couldn't help but feel captivated by its horrific presence. I stared back. Was it dead? It hadn't moved, and I saw no signs of it breathing. I was completely entranced by its eyes. As I looked into them, I felt the strangest sensation of pain, but it didn't feel bad. It was almost refreshing. Believe me, I'm not a masochist, but what I felt then was almost like jumping into a cold pool on a hot summer day without preparation. It just hit me as a shock. Then, I was suddenly used to it. I thought John had been under the same effect as me, but it seemed that this entire course of events had taken place in mere seconds. The engine roared, stirring me out of my trance. I looked at John quickly, confused. Then I looked back at the creature, wanting to feel that odd sensation again. What I saw instead, it horrified me. It lifted its slender arm to the window. Even then, the arm was much longer than I initially thought. It seemed to stretch almost the entire length of its body. Then, I saw its hand. Long pointed fingers jetted out from its palm. Vicious fingers. No, these were more like claws. They all pressed against the window, and the face slowly turned to track the movement of our car. As we drove home, I couldn't help but shiver. John asked me several times what happened, but I just stared forwards. His voice echoed in my ears. It's not that I couldn't respond. I'm not going to give you any bullshit like I had been cursed to never speak about this creature. No, I didn't want to. I didn't want anyone else to know about this sensation I had felt. I wanted to keep it for myself. Nobody else could feel this pain. It was mine to bear. I'll say it once again. I'm not a masochist. I normally avoid any harmful situations out of the fear of hurting myself. The irritation it causes is just ridiculous to me, no matter how dire the wound. But if you could be there, if you could feel the sensation this beast produced, it was addicting. I wanted to feel it again. We were home faster than I realized. John said goodbye and told me to be careful, but I got out of the car without saying a word. I didn't wave either. I just walked up our driveway. The headlights shone on me as I walked, and our motion-sensitive light flickered on a quarter of the walk up. I heard John turn around and take off. I opened my garage door and walked into my house. I walked into my kitchen, still tense from the encounter I just had. I sat at the table and put my hands on my head, thinking about the event that just occurred. I was contemplating what to do when I heard a quiet patter to my side. The flap to our doggy door opened up. I was expecting to see Carly, curious as to who came up the driveway so late at night. What I saw instead, it frightens me to this day. I saw its long arm jet through the door, then its slender torso working its way through. I was reasonably horrified at how the creature fit itself through the small space. As it stuck its head through, I saw its eyes. I instinctively shut my own now that I knew it was alive. Now that I could see its full form. Now that it followed me home and I saw its obsession with me. I didn't want to experience that trance again. Next thing I knew, I was on my back, my bones aching and my skin flaming. I opened my eyes slowly to see the creature draped over my body. I felt a pain in the right part of my chest and looked down. I was horrified. My chest had been torn open. Panic set in quite easily. How was I alive? How did I not black out? Was this thing eating my spleen? My kidney? Are my lungs next? I was horrified. You have never felt terror until you have been forced to witness a creature eating your own organs over your body. I couldn't move. I couldn't pass out. I couldn't die. I wanted to die. The pain was unbearable. The psychological strain I must have felt at that time. It would have driven a person to insanity, but I was still conscious. I hadn't bled out. Why? I felt my body burning. I felt my mouth foaming. My head was spinning. I couldn't even handle the idea of watching myself being torn open and eaten like a bag of chips. Suddenly, the lights flicked on. The creature disappeared almost instantly. I heard a shriek. I saw the legs of both of my parents and my dog yelping uncontrollably as I passed out. I remembered the sudden feeling of relief as my mind faded into the black. I woke up in the hospital half a week later, somehow still alive. Apparently, I lost my spleen and one of my kidneys. My flesh around the area of the injury was mostly artificial, according to the surgeon who greeted me. I looked around for my family. My parents weren't in the room. Instead, a man in a suit sat in a chair at the foot of my bed. He was small and had his hair gelled back. I would say he was 5'6" and seemed to be about 160 pounds. Not much muscle on him. He introduced himself as Mr. Brent. He said it was a code name and I wouldn't need to know much about him. I guess he was a CIA member or something. He paid for my entire operation. I wasn't quite sure what was up with the act of kindness, but it must have been expensive. All he asked was for some answers to his questions. Then he might answer some of mine. So I told him the story. Then he filled in the gaps for me. I guess my parents had gotten a call from John telling them to come get me. John had thought the alcohol had hit me too hard, since I seemed completely phased out on the way back. When my parents found me, they didn't see the creature, only me lying there with my torso torn open. They thought that I was dead until they checked my pulse. Even the doctors in the ER said that I should have been. Apparently, John was found dead the next morning and had apparently died on the walk from his driveway to his house. All his organs were missing. Then, Mr. Brent told me what this creature was. He called it a Wendigo, those things from folklore. They eat human organs and hate light, which is why I guess it chose an abandoned house to live in. Once you see one, it never stops chasing you. Most horrific of all, though, was its saliva. Apparently, it keeps humans alive and conscious through whatever wound is afflicted upon them, so that they feel the full terror and pain that the Wendigo punishes them with, until their heart is consumed. I asked him about the eyes. Apparently, whoever he worked for didn't know about this. I guess I'm one of the few people to live through a Wendigo attack, so not much is known about them. Everybody else is found in a state like John was. I asked him if it was all right to talk to other people about this. He said it was fine, and I could even post it online, since nobody would believe me anyways. That was the last I had seen of Mr. Brent for the week. A week later, I was rushed out of the hospital by what appeared to be a SWAT team. I was put into the back of a white van. Surprisingly enough, my parents, my dog Carly, and Mr. Brent were all sitting in the back. There were 2 bright lights blazing down on us from the ceiling of the van. I asked what was going on, my chest hurting from the pressure of my lungs expanding. Apparently, we were being moved to a secure location. Mr. Brent had told my parents the story of the Wendigo attack. My father at first thought it was all bullshit, but he complied. My mother simply wanted me to be safe. We got to the secure location within a half an hour. Turns out it was a house far away from town, about 5 miles out in the middle of nowhere in an already rural area. While the movers that had our stuff were getting everything into the main corridor, Mr. Brent explained the nature of his organization, but I could tell he left out many details. Apparently, they find people like me who survived paranormal attacks, then protect them in exchange for information. The house itself looked ridiculously expensive. He told us that it has a security alarm system that causes the lights to go on whenever movement is detected. Each room will always be lit when someone's inside, and the outside has large floodlights that go on at night whenever they detect movement. It's the first house in the district connected to the town's power station, and has 10 backup generators. Mr. Brent gave us a schedule for times that we can leave the house safely, from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day of the year. I occasionally hear the lights outside turn on. At first, it startled me, but after a couple of nights in our house, I realized just how safe we were now. I'm only ever nervous when all the lights turn on instantaneously around the foundation, followed by the sound of flickering movement towards the brush. I often talk with my parents about the whole situation. They say that they're just glad they can be sure that we're all safe, and that Mr. Brent and his organization were kind enough to help us. I often wonder if they're being hunted, if even Carly is being hunted. I want to ask Mr. Brent so many questions, but he disappeared after the move-in. I haven't seen a Wendigo since that night, but it's possible I may look outside one night and see it staring at us, hoping for a chance to strike. I just hope that when the time comes, our fortress will hold up, as Brent said. I'm posting this in hopes that whoever reads this will believe me, This isn't about trying to scare you or looking for media attention. This is a warning to everybody who spends late nights out. If you see a shadowy figure in the night, do not leave the light. Do not make the same mistake I did. There's a reason some houses are abandoned, and I fear I may have awoken one of those reasons. My mother never let me look at the family photo albums. I never knew why. Whenever I asked, she would just tell me that they were old and fragile, and would break if we got them down from the shelf. They were so high that I could never reach them as a child, even if I stood on a chair, which I tried many times. Mom always got angry at me for doing this, yelling that I should listen to her and not be so disobedient. I eventually forgot all about them. That is, until last month. I was visiting my mother during my time off work. She's been struggling with her health lately, so I'd like to see her as much as I can. This time, she seemed different, not just physically, but emotionally. She seemed confused and agitated about something. I tried asking her why, but she just told me she was fine and that I was imagining it. But I knew something was up. A couple of days into my visit, I got a text from some of my old school friends asking to meet up. I agreed, and we met at a local pub for a meal the next evening. When I came home, my mother had fallen asleep on the couch, and there it was, sitting on the coffee table, the photo album. I knew she wouldn't approve of me looking at it, but hey, why would she need to find out? I knelt down next to the coffee table, being extra careful not to move the album from its original position. I slowly opened the front cover. It seemed normal. Pictures of Mom and her siblings as kids, and of my granny and granddad, on holiday, at Christmas time, birthdays, you name it. I had no idea why Mom kept them from me. That is, until I found the picture that has changed my life. This particular image caught me off guard, as it was so creepy and unusual. It sent shivers down my spine. It was one of the oldest photos in the album, dated 1945. It's in grayscale, obviously, and depicts my grandfather as a teenager, holding a baby. The most disturbing baby I have ever seen. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate kids. In fact, I'm really good with them. However, this baby was different. She didn't look like a baby at all. Her proportions were of a baby, but her face, God, her face. It was as if you took an elderly woman and stuck her face onto an infant. Her skin was wrinkled and saggy, her eyes small and black, and she had a full set of teeth, huge adult teeth. I couldn't let this go. I had to investigate. I decided to visit my grandparents and try to ask them about the child. They live in a retirement home, not far from my mother's house. I walked there the next morning. I didn't tell my mother that I had looked at the album, informing her that I wanted to visit Granny and Granddad, as I hadn't seen them in a while. When I got to the home, I signed in and asked the head carrier if I could have somewhere quiet to speak with my grandparents. They let us into one of the unused bedrooms. I was anxious, although I had been thinking for some time about how to approach the subject. I engaged them in some small talk first, as it seemed polite and I didn't want to come across as pushy. Then I asked, "Do you have any other sisters?" I asked my granddad. "Maybe a daughter?" He looked at me suspiciously. "Why?" he asked. I could see this question had perturbed him. "I found a photo yesterday of you and a baby in 1945. You would have been 16. The baby appears to have some kind of skin condition. He cut me off. We're not gonna talk about this, he snapped. This took me by surprise and made me even more intrigued to know who the little girl in the picture was. I chose not to approach the subject further, as I didn't want to upset my grandparents. We had some more small talk before I gathered my things and left, just as clueless and much more confused than before. I spent the remaining few days at my mother's house, pondering what I could do to get answers about this strange, unsettling image and the girl depicted in it. The thought of asking my mother about the picture scared me, as I knew she would never forgive me for breaking our one rule. I did, however, ask her what happened to the house that my grandparents used to live in before they went into a care home. That house had been in our family for generations. My mother grew up there, and my grandparents, and my great-grandparents before them. She told me that my grandparents still owned the house, but no one lived there. It stood abandoned and empty. This intrigued me, as I knew that this house may hold clues to this twisted and bizarre puzzle. I knew it was wrong to explore the place without asking my grandparents first, but I knew they would say no, so I decided I was going to do it. I was going to break into the house and search for answers. I decided that the best time to do this was on my way back to town, as the house was in that direction, but was closer to my mother's town, so it would save me the time by driving to mine and coming back. I left on Sunday at around noon. I kissed my mother goodbye, feeling guilty for the betrayal of her and my grandparents' trust that I was about to commit. I got into the car and drove out of town, as if I was going home, but instead of turning onto the motorway, as I typically would, I turned into a nearby village on the rural outskirts of town. I knew where the house was, as my grandparents lived there when I was little. The house stood in decent condition, bar the unkept garden and a few chips in the plastered walls. I got out of my car and peered in through the downstairs window. The house was empty, as I had expected. I walked over to the front door. It was locked, but I slammed into it with all my strength a few times and it flung open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was a rancid, musty smell, like rotting vegetables mixed with old shoe polish. The house was cold. In fact, it seemed even colder than it did outside. I stepped diligently in, even though I knew there was no alarm system. The walls were covered with flowery wallpaper that now looked comically dated. It was like stepping into the past. The kitchen was tiled, and the rest of the house was floored with dark brown carpet. The kitchen diner was empty, apart from an old log burner oven and a single dining chair. I moved into the living room. To my surprise, there was an old television. I tried switching it on, but it only came up with static. There was a cupboard built into the wall, next to the doorway which led to the landing. I looked inside and found a box. Excitedly, I pulled out the box, which blew dust into my face and made me sneeze. I placed the box down on the carpet and squatted down to open it up. Inside was a collection of items that seemed as if they belonged to a little girl. A doll, some beads and string, and a book of fairy tales. This was a big breakthrough for me, and so I put the box into the boot of my car before re-entering the house. I walked back through the kitchen and living room and entered the hallway. There were stairs along the right side of the wall, and a corridor along the left with a door at the end. I decided to see what was in there. To my disappointment, it was just a small bathroom with a toilet and sink. I headed upstairs. There were 4 doors coming off the upstairs landing, 2 on each side and 1 on the back wall in the center. I decided to check the rooms on the right-hand side first. The first one was a small bathroom, with a bath and a sink. The next room was a tiny room with only a toilet. This is a common trend in older British homes. On the left side of the hallway, there were 2 bedrooms. One master bedroom, with a sad-looking bed frame in the middle with no mattress. There was an empty secondary bedroom with light green walls. Now all that was left was the single door at the end of the hallway. I opened it, expecting another bedroom. To my surprise, there was a set of stairs leading up to the attic. The narrow-walled stairway looked dilapidated and ugly. There was no paint or wallpaper, just exposed brick. The stairs were wooden and rickety looking. I wasn't even sure if I should go up, but I knew I would never stop thinking about it if I didn't. I put my foot forward onto the first step, gingerly shifting my weight onto it. The step creaked like a rusty old door hinge. I cautiously climbed up, keeping my hands on the walls. The attic was empty and even colder than the rest of the house. It almost felt freezing. I wandered around the room, examining the walls and making sure I wasn't missing anything. I decided that there was no more to see and that it was time to head home. I turned to walk back down the staircase when I heard it, the deep guttural moan. It sounded like an animal may be trapped in the wall. I felt sorry for it and felt that I had to do something. I walked into the middle of the room and froze, listening for any indication of where the sound may be coming from. I heard it again. It seemed to be coming from the floor. I laid down and pressed my ear against the cold, dank floorboards. I heard the quiet sound of breathing. It was chesty and sounded almost like wheezing, as if whatever was trapped down there was having an asthma attack. I ran out to my car and drove to the local DIY store to pick up a hatchet. I was filled with despair for what I was about to do to my grandparents' house, but I couldn't just let the creature die down there. I drove back to the house and made my way back to the attic with the hatchet. I stared at the floor as my heart filled with shame and disgust. Before swinging the hatchet and chopping into the floorboards, the wood cracked with a loud crash. I kept cutting away until the board was loose enough to dislodge. I moved the wooden slat aside and turned on my phone's flashlight. I shone the bright light into the hole. There was a narrow crawl space full of dust and cobwebs, but I couldn't see any animal. The fetid smell that had hit me upon entering the house was nauseatingly strong here. I tried making some noises to call over any animal which could have been lurking down there. Then, I heard a scratching sound, like something shuffling along inside the crawl space. Something which clearly didn't have much room down there. This surprised me, as I had presumed it was something small, like a rat or a hedgehog. But this seemed to be something bigger, something which was squished and struggling to move in the crawl space. The hole from the single removed floorboard was not large enough for me to get my head through to take a closer look. So I got back up and picked up my hatchet to remove another board. This one came up easier than the last, as I had the gap to get my hands in and pull it up. I poked my head down into the void. What I saw will never leave me. There, in the corner of the crawl space, was the most repulsive and disgusting creature I have ever seen. It had human-like flesh that sagged like a puddle around its lump-like body, as if it was wearing skin that was far too big for it. Its lifeless, hollow black eyes stared back at me, like I was looking into an eternal darkness. It seemed almost human. It had hands and feet, with nails that curled around like infectious, discolored spirals. It opened its mouth to reveal the most rotten and vile teeth I have ever seen. There were many of them, racked up inside the mouth of the being, as if it had grown multiple sets of teeth on top of one another. They varied in decay as they went further into its mouth. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move my body. I was paralyzed with shock and disgust. The thing looked at me, reaching out one of its saggy and gnarled arms. It was almost as if it wanted me to help it, like it didn't want to be down there. Its eyes looked almost sad. I got up and decided to call someone. I called the police. I didn't know what else to do. The cops arrived about 10 minutes later. I showed them the entity, slumped inside the crawl space. They demanded that I leave. I asked them to keep me updated, but they didn't reply. Petrified and utterly dumbfounded, I drove back to my home. I didn't know whether to call my grandparents or mother, or to leave it. Did they know about this? I distanced myself from everyone for weeks. I was unable to go to work or even eat most days. I lost a lot of weight and my hair was long and unkempt. I need to put an end to this, I thought. I got in my car and drove to my mother's house. I knocked on the door. It opened, but my mother wasn't standing there. A young man stood in the doorway, about my age. "Who are you?" I asked. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why are you knocking on my door?" "This is my mother's house," I stated, confused. "Well," he said, "unless I'm your mother, then you must have the wrong house. I moved here a week ago." I just ran to my car. I was on the verge of breaking down at this point. What the hell was going on? I rushed to my grandparents' retirement home, ignoring the speed limits. I ran up to the door and barged in, leaving the door open as I ran to the front desk. "I need to see Janet and Frederick Worth, now," I demanded. The receptionist looked at me, confused. "Haven't you heard?" she asked. Mr. Worth was arrested 2 weeks ago for the imprisonment and torture of his sister."